All right, I limited the videos to 15 minutes and I went over on the last one, so it automatically stopped recording, but I did not make any further progress. So we left off with the event handler that I'm creating for the speed monitor. So I was explaining that it's good practice to have your event start with on, to say that on something, that's when I want this to be triggered. So for the speed monitor going over 2 knots, so I'll just call it on excess, or on, how about this, on fast speed, okay? And the event doesn't need anything, and in order to raise that event in this scriptable object, I'm also going to include a public function that other that can be triggered. We won't call this event directly from the scriptable object from another game object. We're just going to let the scriptable object itself call its own event. Okay, and that'll be made more evident or obvious as we continue this. So we're going to call a helper function, let's say. So void, and we're going to call it raise, on fast speed event. This name could be anything you want, but I like to call it something similar to what the actual event is. I want to make sure that when I fire the event off, so on fast speed, I want to only invoke it if there are listeners, if there are other game objects listening for this event to be fired off. So that's why I'm using the question mark dot invoke. Otherwise I would write it the long way. So the old way was you would have to check to see if it's null. If on fast speed does not equal null, then you call the actual event. This is a shorthand way of firing off an event and also checking to make sure that there are listeners. Okay, so let's just start with that. So on fast speed. Oh, and in order for my scriptable object to be visible, so I've created this object. However, if I went back to my editor, it's gonna refresh. It's kind of recompiling scripts. But if I went to my menu, if I wanted to right-click on here and say Create Scriptable Objects, that particular scriptable object with the speed monitor, it's not in here. And that's because you have to tell Unity to create an asset menu, and all of my scriptable objects I'm placing within this path. So scriptable objects, and I'm going to call it exactly what it is, speed monitor scriptable object, SO. Okay, so now I can go back to my editor, and when I right click and I go create scriptable objects, there's my speed monitor scriptable object, and there's only going to be one of these, so I'm just going to keep it exactly the same name as the class. So speed monitor SO. There's nothing public as far as properties that are exposed. Okay. And what I mean by that is if I went into the scriptable object above the event and typed like public int a number, and I went back to the Unity editor, my speed monitor now has a number, and then you can have that number be whatever you want. But I really don't have a need for that, right? I just want this to be an object that fires off events. All right. So let's go back to the Unity editor, and on my level UI, this particular speed in knots that's being displayed, if you remember from the last video, I have a speed display container. And I just have to remember now how that's being updated. So there's a script that is called the speed monitor, and I know this because of working on this for a few years now. So on the player itself, the player is an actual 3D mesh. So I will show you that. I will take off the isometric view, zoom into the player. So here's the player, and the player has quite a few controls on it, but one of them will be this speed monitor. And you'll see, I'm going to open that script so I can refresh my memory as far as what the speed monitor is doing. Okay, so the speed monitor this text mesh pro speed text is coming from this game object from the UI. So the speed display container contains a speed text. Text mesh pro text, that's just a property that you could add, right? And that is being fed into the speed monitor. All right, so if I actually went back to the player and if I clicked on speed monitor, I'll just shrink these so that we're focusing only on the speed monitor. If I selected speed text, like what is this speed text? Notice on the UI, it highlighted the game object, right? If I clicked on rigid body, it highlighted player because the player has a rigid body that reacts to physics. But if I select speed monitor, it reminds me that, hey, this speed text is coming from here. So that's where the speed monitor, since I already have this script built, and there's a fixed update method that runs at a fixed physics update rate. So rather than updating every frame, you know, depending on your GPU or your RAM, that frame rate might change. Fixed update runs consistently every, and I forget the actual number, but there's a millisecond that it runs consistently, so you have stability. It's a great place to add anything that involves physics. That's where you want the update. So in this fixed update, that's where the calculation of the velocity, so the local velocity of the ship, okay, rigid body dot velocity, that's when it's getting updated. So if I want to see what that is in my fixed update, I could simply make a print statement, and let's print knots. As a matter of fact, let's try this new, see if that'll work. Because I read some article that said this is actually a really good way of doing it, destructuring, but I'm getting an error. If you notice that, it's like, hey, there's no argument given that corresponds. So, maybe I read that incorrectly. Let's just do it the old-fashioned way. Print knots. I'll give myself a hint as to where I am. So inside, the script is called speed monitor, and I'll say the function is fixed update. And we'll leave it at that, plus knots. So I'll go back to my script, or my editor, and you'll see the console. So that's going to be displayed here in the console. I'll clear it, play, right? Should be expected to be 0, so there it is. If you look, it's running every fixed update, so you can see that number increasing as far as how many times it's being printed out. So it's already been printed out 500 times. And if I start to
starboard engine stop, port engine stop, port engine ahead 1/3, rudder amidships, starboard engine ahead 1/3.
I'll pause the game. You see the fixed update, the speed is gradually increasing. Now this is showing me in knots, right, how fast I'm going. And if you look at my speed monitor display, 0.9 knots reflects it's being rounded, so 0.090 here in the console. So that's working. So, you know, logically I'm thinking, okay, well, if that gets above 2 knots, then that's when I want my event to trigger, my speed monitor scriptable object. I need that to trigger, okay? So let's create a place. Let's create a place for that scriptable object. First, I'm going to create a header, and I want this to be scriptable object references. This is just so in the Unity editor, it's broken out in a way that I can keep track of what's happening here as far as sections. I'm going to call these props just for now. And in there, I'm going to have a serialized field, which means it's exposed to the editor, but it's private. And I want a speed monitor scriptable object called speed monitor scriptable object. Okay, so that's going to be an instance of one of the scriptable object that I wrote. So player, the script for speed monitor, you'll see that now the reason why I wanted to kind of organize a certain way is because now I know this section is titled scriptable object references. I need a speed monitor scriptable object there. I'll stick that in. while the props are just my other exposed variables, like speed, text, rigid body. All right, so now that I have access to this speed monitor scriptable object, if I went back to my code, and let's say right beneath where I'm printing out the speed monitor, if I said speed monitor scriptable object, and I want to see what events do I have in this particular scriptable object, I click on the lightning bolt, and there's my, my event. But if you remember, I did not want to call that directly. That helper function called raise on fast speed event, that's where we want to focus on, okay? So after it runs every fixed update right now, it's going to actually fire that event off. We don't want that. I want it to only fire off if the ship's speed in knots exceeds 2 knots. Let's tell you what, let's do 3 knots, okay? So if ship speed in knots, and gotta get my spelling right, ship speed in knots is greater than 3, that's when we want to fire off this particular event, okay? And let's take a look at this. So speed, and I'm using a number right directly in there. That's not good programming practice either. Always good to have variables saved. So I'm going to create another serialized field, and this is going to be a float. Since we're using floats over ints for the ship speed, I'll have a float, and we'll call that the, I don't know, fast speed, or speed limit. Speed limit is going to be equal to 5, and it's a float, so I put foxtrot at the end there, F, and now I can replace this variable with speed limit. So if the ship speed exceeds the speed limit, that's when this event is going to be raised. But there are no listeners right now, right? So right now there are no other scripts that are listening out for this event. So on my speed display container, why don't we create another script? Okay, so let's click on the speed container, add component. Let's call this the speed limit manager. So this is going to manage the speed display. All right, so I launch this, and I know my videos are going to be limited to 15 minutes. So I'm going to get rid of all this boilerplate stuff, and I know I want a header with ScriptableObjects references, and in there I want that speed monitor. So speed monitor, ScriptableObjects, speed monitor. This is the scriptable object that they both are going to have in common. And I know when I enable this object, I want to have the speed monitor scriptable objects event. Okay, so if I click the dot this time, I'm listening out for the event. And if I put a print in here, so maybe let's put a print, and we'll just write something like speed limit exceeded. All right, and let's go back to the editor, and let's get that speed limit scriptable object. All right, and for now, I'm just going to move my player to a different place in the level, away from, because if we kept them on the piers and we went over the speed limit, we'll crash into all all those little boats I put there. So let's move the player into some open ocean, and let's test this out. Okay, so we have the speed display container listening for the player's speed monitor, and if it exceeds 3 knots, we should get an event. I'm just verifying that I used 3 knots as the, I used 5. Let's make that 3. So speed limit will be 3 knots. Okay, so start the game.
Port engine stop. Starboard engine stop.
Here I am at console.
Rudder amidships.
2/3.
Port engine ahead
Let's go
1/3.
standard.